They say money doesn't see color, but what if the people controlling it do? On a bright afternoon in Atlanta, Georgia, the sun gleamed off the black paint of a Rolls-Royce Phantom as it glided into the parking lot of one of the city's most prestigious banks. The building, an imposing structure of glass and steel, stood as a symbol of financial power and exclusivity. David Johnson stepped out of the car, his movements smooth and deliberate. Heads turned. A tall, broad-shouldered black man in his early 40s, David was impeccably dressed in a navy blue Armani suit, his polished leather shoes clicking against the concrete, a subtle glint from his gold cufflinks catching the light. David had spent the last decade building a tech empire from scratch. A child of Atlanta's working-class neighborhoods, he knew the sting of prejudice and the challenges of breaking barriers. Yet here he was, a millionaire on a mission to improve his city. Today, he was here for something straightforward, transferring $500,000 to his foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to funding underprivileged schools across the South. But what awaited him inside the bank was far from routine. Through the glass doors, Linda Harper stood at the counter, surveying the room. The branch manager, in her mid-50s, radiated a no-nonsense demeanor with her neatly styled blonde bob and ever-present pearl necklace. To Linda, David was an anomaly, a man whose appearance didn't fit her narrow idea of who deserved to walk through those doors. The moment he entered, her professional smile slipped into something colder. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone cool and clipped. David returned her stare with a warm smile. He was used to this kind of reception, but had learned long ago that dignity and composure were his greatest weapons. What began as a transactional visit would soon unravel, laying bare an ugly truth that had festered for too long. David placed a leather folder on the counter and slid it toward Linda. Inside were meticulously prepared documents for the wire transfer. Linda flipped through them without care, her movements slow, almost mocking. "Do you even have an account with us?" she asked, her voice laced with condescension. David inhaled deeply, keeping his tone measured. "Yes, I've been a client here for 5 years. My account number is listed on the first page." Linda tapped a manicured nail on the folder, then closed it with a snap. "I'm going to need proof of income for this amount," she said, crossing her arms. "Proof of income? That's not a standard requirement for wire transfers," David replied, "and my account holds more than enough to cover this transaction." "Be that as it may," Linda said, leaning in, her voice dropping to a patronizing whisper, "we have protocols. Large sums like this require scrutiny, especially when unconventional clients are involved." The room fell silent as her words hung in the air. Other customers glanced over, sensing the growing tension. David straightened, his calm exterior unshaken. "Unconventional," he repeated. "Are you suggesting that my race disqualifies me from receiving the same services as your other clients?" Linda's cheeks turned pink, but her posture remained defiant. "I'm saying that large transactions are typically reserved for individuals with established reputations," she replied. David raised an eyebrow, suppressing the urge to lash out. He had faced worse than Linda Harper in his lifetime. But this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been silently turned away. Instead of escalating the situation, David pulled out his phone and navigated to a recent Forbes article. The headline read, "Atlanta's tech tycoon gives back. David Johnson donates $5 million to education reform." A large photo accompanied the article, showing David alongside the city's mayor at a charity gala. He held the screen out toward Linda, his expression unreadable. "This is me," he said simply. "Perhaps this establishes the reputation you're looking for." Linda barely glanced at the screen before waving it off. "Anyone can create a flashy website," she said dismissively. "Sir, I suggest you take your business to an institution more familiar with your unique circumstances." By now, Several customers had pulled out their phones, recording the unfolding scene. A young woman in yoga pants whispered to her friend, "Is she serious right now?" A man in a business suit muttered, "This is going to end badly for her." David, still composed, placed his phone on the counter. "If you think this is over, Ms. Harper, I assure you it's not." The tension shattered as a deep voice rang out. "Linda, is there a problem here?" Robert Franklin, the regional director, strode toward the counter. His salt and pepper hair and tailored gray suit gave him an air of authority that silenced the room. Linda's confidence faltered. "Mr. Franklin, I was just explaining our policies to this gentleman," Linda began. David interrupted, his voice calm but firm. "I've been a client here for years, and I'm attempting a wire transfer for a charitable cause. However, it seems Ms. Harper has concerns about my eligibility." Robert's sharp eyes darted between them. "Mr. Johnson, I'm familiar with your work. It's an honor to meet you," he said, extending his hand. "Let me handle this personally." Linda opened her mouth to protest, but Robert silenced her with a raised hand. "We'll discuss this later," he said curtly. David explained the situation in detail, omitting nothing. Robert listened intently, his expression growing darker with every word. "This behavior is unacceptable," he said finally. "Rest assured, it will be addressed." Linda tried to interject, grasping at straws. "I was following protocol, high-risk clients." "High risks," Robert snapped. "Mr. Johnson is one of our most valuable clients. If anyone here is high risk, Linda, it's you, for jeopardizing this bank's reputation." After completing the transaction, David requested a private meeting with Robert in the conference room. He placed a thick envelope on the table. "What's this?" Robert asked. "Documentation," David replied. "Over the past year, I've gathered evidence of discriminatory practices at this branch, emails, witness accounts, video footage, you name it. Linda's behavior today isn't an isolated incident." Robert flipped through the contents, his face turning pale. "Why didn't you come to me sooner?" David leaned back, his expression thoughtful. "I wanted to see if the institution would course correct on its own. But clearly, that didn't happen." Robert nodded solemnly. "Consider this the beginning of a complete overhaul." The next morning, the story hit the media like wildfire. "Tech millionaire faces racism at Atlanta bank sparks national debate." Videos of the incident amassed millions of views, igniting outrage on social media. Hashtags like #BankingWhileBlack and #JusticeForDavid trended for days. The bank released a formal apology, but it wasn't enough to quell the storm. Protests erupted outside the branch, and prominent figures called for systemic reform. Within days, Linda was fired, her once bright career reduced to ashes. David, however, wasn't satisfied with just retribution. Partnering with civil rights organizations, he launched a national campaign advocating for financial equity. His foundation gained millions in donations, transforming a moment of injustice into a movement for change. Weeks later, David received a letter from a young woman in Chicago. "I saw your story," it read. "Because of you, I walked into a bank today and opened my first account. Thank you for inspiring me to believe I belong." David smiled as he folded the letter, feeling the weight of its significance. What had started as a simple transaction had become a catalyst for change. For David, this was never just about money, it was about challenging a system and paving the way for others to succeed. 3 months after the incident, David stood on stage during the launch of his equity and banking initiative. The auditorium was packed, cameras rolling. He revealed a surprise announcement. "Today, I'm proud to announce that I've purchased a controlling share in the very bank where this incident took place," David declared. Gasps rippled through the room. "But I didn't stop there." My first executive decision was to implement new policies to ensure fairness and equity in every branch. The screen behind David flickered, displaying a handwritten note. He read it aloud. Mr. Johnson, I owe you an apology. Though you don't know me, years ago, I was a single mother struggling to make ends meet. One day, you came into my diner and left a $1,000 tip with a note that said, "Kindness has no price. Pay it forward when you can." That tip saved me and my kids, but years later I failed you. I stayed silent while you were treated unfairly. Your grace reminded me of the kindness you showed me. Thank you for inspiring me to be better. David looked up. That letter came from Linda Harper. He said, stunning the audience. She is now leading our outreach program, focused on addressing bias and improving community relations. The crowd erupted into applause, realizing the story had come full circle. David had not only fought for justice, but had also proved that even those who falter could find redemption through accountability and effort. As David left the stage, a reporter asked him, "What's next for you?" David smiled, thinking of the boy from the school, the letter from Chicago, and the countless lives still waiting to be changed. "This is just the beginning," he said. "We're building a future where everyone belongs." The crowd cheered, and David walked away, his legacy now larger than himself, a movement born from a single moment of injustice destined to reshape an entire industry.